Was appeasement a cowardly policy? During the 1930s, Germany repeatedly broke the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler rearmed, he reoccupied the Rhineland, and united with Austria. And in 1938 he turned his sights on Czechoslovakia. Not till 1939, when he invaded Poland, did Britain say stop. So why did Britain not act earlier? Britain's approach to Germany in the 30s is known as appeasement. Some people, like Winston Churchill, thought it was a cowardly policy. But was it? The British Prime Minister from 1937 until 1940 was Neville Chamberlain, and he was closely identified with appeasement. Chamberlain was so convinced that he had the right approach, some people found him arrogant. He certainly tried hard to make it work. He made 3 trips to Germany by air to negotiate with Hitler over Czechoslovakia. This is how Chamberlain described appeasement.
By the exercise of friendliness and understanding of what were the desires of others, to clear up all differences by discussion without armed conflict.
Hitler used the threat of armed conflict a number of times to achieve his ends. As part of his plan to take over Czechoslovakia, he threatened to invade one part of it, the Sudetenland, claiming that the German-speaking people living there were being persecuted by the Czech government.
Since he took office, Mr. Chamberlain has never wavered in his determination to establish peace in Europe.
So Chamberlain visited Hitler at his mountaintop residence in Berchtesgaden to cut a deal.
In courteous but perfectly definite terms, Herr Hitler made it plain that he had made up his mind that the Sudeten Germans must have the right of self-determination. And he declared categorically that rather than wait, he would be prepared to risk a world war. I undertook to return at once to consult with my colleagues. I have no doubt whatever now, looking back, that my visit alone prevented an invasion for which everything was ready.
Chamberlain went back to Hitler a second time, quite confident now that they had an agreement. But at that point, Hitler stepped up his demands and threatened war unless he could have the Sudetenland immediately. In desperation, Britain, France, Germany and Italy met at Munich and agreed to Hitler's terms. The Czech leader Beneš was in Munich too, but Hitler refused to let him enter the conference room. Later, Beneš wrote in his memoirs,
I had sufficient diplomatic experience to see that Europe was hastening to its doom as a result of universal selfishness. Without our participation, the Munich Agreement, fatal for Europe and the whole world, was concluded and signed by the 4 great powers and then forced upon us.
For Beneš then, appeasement meant that Britain would avoid getting into a war whatever the cost to others. But Chamberlain believed that Hitler did have some reasonable demands, and he had extracted a promise from Hitler that he would make no more territorial demands in Europe. But 6 months later, in March 1939, the Germans annexed the main part of what was left of Czechoslovakia. Hitler had broken his promise to Chamberlain, and that same month Chamberlain changed his policy. Britain signed a pact promising to protect Poland. This was supposed to send a signal to Hitler that Britain would not accept further German expansion. Britain prepared for war. But Hitler didn't believe the British would go to war over Poland, since they hadn't stood up to him over Czechoslovakia. Hitler went ahead with his invasion, and Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. Appeasement had been abandoned. One of appeasement's most outspoken critics, Winston Churchill, replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister in 1940. For 50 years following World War II, appeasement was seen to have failed. But before the war, many people thought it was the right thing to do. Why? Appeasement had its origins in the Treaty of Versailles. There were British politicians who felt the terms were too harsh. Many of the agreements Britain signed with Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s were intended to reduce the severity of the treaty. People in Britain remembered the horrors of the First World War and didn't want to have to fight again. Some people even campaigned for peaceful solutions to international problems.
£2,000 million a year spent on arms.
I'd fight tomorrow if I thought a war would end war, but that's what they told my father in 1914, and we're no better off now.
Permanent peace can be secured by discussion. I've no quarrel with Frenchmen or Germans or Russians or anybody else for that matter. So let's be sensible and work together for peace by reason.
Chamberlain and others dreaded the prospect of war. During the crisis over Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain made this radio broadcast.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing.
Chamberlain wasn't alone in feeling that the affairs of Eastern Europe were none of Britain's business. For most people, the Empire was still the UK's #1 priority, and Britain was already overstretched defending that.
Our military forces in their present state are still far from sufficient to meet our defence commitments, which now extend from the Mediterranean into the Far East. We cannot foresee the time when our forces will be strong enough to safeguard our territory, trade and vital interests against Germany, Italy and Japan simultaneously.
Britain was rearming, but in 1938 it still wasn't ready for a war. Very little money had been spent on arms during the Depression in the early 1930s. And if Britain did have to fight Hitler, Chamberlain wasn't convinced he'd get the support he'd need from other countries. The French were plagued by weak and unstable governments, and Chamberlain didn't feel he could count on them. The USA, meanwhile, was following a policy of isolationism, deliberately keeping out of European affairs. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was committed to the spread of world revolution, and Chamberlain, like many in the West, distrusted them. That left the Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and South Africa. They'd all helped Britain fight the First World War. Their dead lay in cemeteries in France, Belgium and Turkey. None of the Dominions wanted to be involved in another horrific war. Only Canada said it would support Britain in a war over Czechoslovakia. So, in the 1930s, appeasement could be seen as a reasonable and pragmatic policy. It certainly bought Britain 12 months to rearm. But did it, as its critics claim, make war inevitable because Hitler thought he could do what he liked? The big question in this programme was why did the Second World War break out only 20 years after the end of the First? To try to answer, we broke down this big question into 6 smaller ones. About the peace treaty, the Weimar Republic, Hitler's rise to power, the League of Nations, Hitler's own plans, and appeasement. Now, after looking at these smaller questions, you have to evaluate how important these factors were. Were they all needed to create the conditions for a war? Would the war have happened if one had been missing? How do they link together? And which one was the most important?
The last item is the silhouette frame pig, dated 1825.